Hello friends, welcome back. In the previous tutorial, we discussed how to use modules to divide a game into manageable segments. Today, we'll talk about loading assets in Godot and why you should give it some thought before starting a large game project. Loading assets into Godot is simple. We are provided two functions, load and preload, to help us. To load a scene or resource from your project folder, simply pass the file path to either of these functions. You can find the file path to anything in your project by right-clicking on the file in the File System dock and selecting Copy Path. The difference between load and preload is that preload will load everything passed to it before the game program starts to run, while load will load anything passed to it in real time as the game program is running. If your game is tiny and uses only a few small assets, then you don't really need to have to worry about how loading affects the game's performance. However, when your game project is medium to large and loads new assets frequently, performance problems will become an issue. If this is the case, it is prudent to develop a strategy for loading assets into memory before starting your project. Here are 3 general strategies you might follow. First, if your game is small enough, you can load all of the assets the program needs to run before the game actually starts and avoid loading additional assets altogether while the players are playing. However, some games are too large to have everything loaded into memory at once. Therefore, a second strategy is to load and unload assets while the game is running, but have strict control over the timing of when the game is allowed to load and unload assets. For example, loading assets can be restricted to times of transition where a loading screen can be displayed. Finally, if your game absolutely needs to load and unload assets while the player is playing, a third strategy is parallel multi-thread processing, where the game logic runs on one thread, while loading takes place at the same time on a second thread. Since my Godot RPG project doesn't particularly require cutting-edge performance, I've opted for a combination of the first and second strategy. The core of the program loads in the beginning, but areas of the game world are loaded and unloaded at times of transition when the player is presented with a loading screen. My project is able to do this with the help of the XP Asset Server. The XP Asset Server is a globally auto-loaded script responsible for loading, unloading, and instancing all assets in the game. Modules and special systems such as databases are assigned a load list. Each load list contains lists of file paths to assets in the project required for the module or system to function correctly. The load list file paths can be parsed by the asset server and subsequently loaded into memory. When an asset has been registered with the asset server, an instance of it can be made anywhere in the code. Each file path is associated with a unique string key. To retrieve an instance of an asset, a request is made to the asset server using the desired asset's string key. When a module or area in the game world is removed from the scene tree, the asset server will use the associated load list a final time to remove all of the assets from the list from memory. In summary, when a module loads, it has a load list that is passed to the asset server. The asset server loads all of the assets on the list and stores references to them via the asset's unique string key. When the asset server receives a request for an asset, it looks up the asset via the passed string key, creates an instance of the asset, and returns it to the caller. When a module is removed from the scene tree, its load list is again passed to the asset server. This time, the asset server removes all of the assets from the list from memory. We can see an example of this in my Godot RPG project. I've gone ahead and made a new game item for us to play with, some taiyaki, a Japanese fish-shaped cake. In the inspector, I've given the taiyaki the following properties: a hardcode name that acts as a unique string ID, a name code and blurb code that the translator uses to translate the item name and description into the supported language. I've checked the inventory usable box and left the battle usable and knowledge tree usable boxes unchecked. The max amount of taiyaki the player's inventory can hold will be 99. Finally, I've overwritten the base item's onInventoryUse function. When a player uses the taiyaki item, it will restore 9,999 HP to a party member. Not too shabby for a fish-shaped cake. Our taiyaki item is sitting in our game project, but it's not actually part of the game yet. For items to be usable in the game, they need to be loaded to the asset server via a load list. The load list we're looking for is managed by the item database. To make editing load lists quick and easy, I've built a load list editor which can be accessed via Project, Tools, XP Load List Editor. I'll open the item database's load list. And create a new entry for our Taiyaki item by entering the unique string ID and a file path to the Taiyaki item scene. Once we save over the item database's load list to finalize the changes, our new item is officially added to the game. The EXPWorld module is responsible for loading all databases. In fact, the EXPWorld module has its own load list, and the item database is one of the entries. Therefore, when the game runs and the XP module loads, it loads the item database, and the item database in turn loads all of the items, including our Taiyaki, into memory via the asset server. But we have one more problem. Although the game now knows what Taiyaki is, we still won't find any unless we make some. Not to worry, with the power of the asset server, we can conjure as many as we need. For example, let's put some Taiyaki into the player's item inventory. Here I've opened up the item inventory scene. The item inventory inherits from the base inventory class. Because of this, we can override its virtual functions. One of these functions is setupNewGame, which gets called when the player starts a new game. It is here where we can put items into the item inventory by default. To make our Taiyaki, we just need to make a call to the XP asset server's instance function and pass it the Taiyaki's unique ID. If we pass this Taiyaki item to the inventory's insert function, it will add one Taiyaki to the inventory. To add more than one, pass an amount along with it. Now when we run the game and head straight to the inventory, we have a batch of freshly baked Taiyaki ready for our characters to eat. If you're interested in learning more about my RPG project, you can download it for yourself over at the Dave the Dev Community Patreon, where I upload an update on the 5th of every month. Finally, I'd like to give a patron shout out to Will. Will is working on a farming sim inspired by the events of the early 1900s. The project is still in early development, but head over to Reddit to check it out, link below. I particularly like the art style. And that brings us to the end. Let me know in the comments below if you've been enjoying the last few videos about my RPG project, or if you want to see more traditional Godot tutorials like I've made before. If the general feeling is that we want to continue in this direction, then the next tutorial will be about XP Persist, my RPG project's save and load system. Hope to see you again. Until then, happy deving!